So, welcome to the last segment of this whole music theory tutorial, Music Theory 101 tutorial. And this last segment is something that I hold very near and dear. It is one of my favorite areas in music theory because it is so rich and accounts for so many moods in music. And if you can get yourself a grasp on it, you're going to understand a lot about how music is built. Now, one thing to understand is that even though we are going to go what seems to be really deep here, this is still kind of the tip of the iceberg. There is so much in this that you can do. This is still Music Theory 101. So, all right, we've looked at intervals, we've looked at scale tones, we've looked at why they're named what they are, and so now what we're going to do is we're going to bring all of that around and we're going to start building chords with this. So, all right, here are all our scale tones, excuse me. What we're going to pull out of this are our chord tones. Let's start with three-part chords. What we are going to concern ourselves with for the time being are the root, third, and fifth. So, if we take just the root, third, and fifth out of this scale, giving us C, E, and G, that is a major chord. One of the most basic fundamental building blocks in contemporary music. Or this. Every note that you heard played there was either a C, E, or a G. Some of these chords have 6 notes in them, but all of those notes are either C, E, or G. Some of them are just repeated here and there. So that's something not to be confused about. It's simpler than you think. So that's major, 3-part. Minor is the root, third, and fifth again, but what we are going to do is we are going to flat the third. So if you remember when we talked about what we talked about in our accidental lesson, when we flat something, we take it down a half step. So when we build ourselves a minor chord, we have C, E flat, and G. So minor chord being more of a somber sounding chord. Here's our C minor chord. Every chord, again, every note in this is either a C, an E flat, or a G. Same thing with this one. There are a ton of different ways that you can play these chords because all of these chords, or all of these notes, there are multiple places where you could play an E flat on the guitar, C or G. So there's that. Now, okay, I'm really gonna very quickly. I'm gonna just mention, just so that you know, because it is a part of it. It's not something you're gonna have to worry about too much right now. These are sort of special case chords in a weird way. Are augmented chords and diminished chords. So an augmented chord is a major chord. Augmented. Augmented refers to, in this case, the fifth. So what we're going to do is we are going to raise the fifth. So we're going to have a root, a third, and a raised fifth. And giving us, obviously, C, E, and G sharp. So, so that's your augmented chord. Augmented chords sound really quickly, something like this. Sorry, I played an extra note in there. You'll hear it in blues sometimes. There are different places you'll hear that one. It's not anywhere near as common as major or minor, but it does indeed exist. And then the last sort of kind of rudimentary three-part chord is the diminished chord. And the diminished chord is basically a minor chord. So root, flat 3, and 5, but you flat your 5 as well. So, it's a really sort of like aggressively kind of, almost kind of sort of scary sound in a way. Well, that's a diminished 7, but that's the basic sound of the diminished chord. So our most fundamental three-part chords are these. Let me just spell this out really quickly. You may have done it yourself. We have C, E flat, and G flat for diminished. Root flat 3 and flat 5. So now there are certain three-part chords that will appear far more often than you will ever see an augmented or a diminished chord in popular music. All right, I'm going to keep this major and minor for the time being. Let's just keep the major actually for the time being. Now, under this sort of special case three-part chord, these are what are known as suspended chords. And suspended chords means that you're kind of moving around, altering the third. You're either raising it or lowering it. So you're either raising or lowering the third to the fourth or the second. So first type is the sus2 chord. So that gives you root 2 and 5. We're taking the third, lowering it to 2. So we have C, D, and G. The reason that I kept us in C right now, as you'll notice the farther we go along, we talked about the other keys and things like that. If we did this in some wild key like F sharp, all of a sudden everything would just go completely pear-shaped, and when we had to flat and raise certain things, it would just get really hairy. So that's why we're keeping this, just so you can get a nice fundamental understanding of how this stuff goes. That's why we're in C. So, okay, so our sus2 means we're suspending this third, taking it down to 2. Sus2 is a great sound. It's a nice neutral sounding kind of chord. Here's our C sus2, probably the most common voicing for it. You'll notice it's got a nice airy sort of neutral sound, not major, not minor. I really like that chord. So the other way, as I was saying, you could suspend a chord is from the third up to the fourth, giving you a sus4 chord. And so as that is spelled, root 4 and 5, giving you C, F, and G. So, what that sounds like is this here. That is probably the most common voicing for a C sus4. Now, where you'll hear people use these suspensions a lot of times they'll use them as just static chords. They'll stand in for major chords or something like that, or minor chords. But one way that you'll hear people play them a lot is back to back with the major chord. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go from C to C sus4, back to C, then to C sus2. So we have C major here. Now I'm going to go to C sus4, back to C, C sus2. Very recognizable sound. So the C sus2 are just the suspensions. That's what they refer to. When you hear somebody talk about suspension, they're talking about moving the third to either the second or the fourth. So, okay. there are our 3-part chords for the time being. Obviously, we have not scratched the surface with that at all, really, because you could take that chord, all those chords I just did, and spell them out in every one of these keys. So there's a whole ton you can do here. I'm just giving you the very basic groundwork for it. So let's get a little bit into 4-part chords as well. Now best place to start with a 4-part chord is to look at our major 7 chord. Sort of notated as this, or sometimes in certain circumstances, some guys will write the root major 7 starting on C as triangle 7. You may see that in some places. So to build a major 7 chord, our first 4-part chord, we are going to have root, 3, 5, and 7, giving us C, E, G, and B. So, major 7 chord, great sound. It's a nice, another sort of airy sounding, optimistic sounding major chord. There's like a really stacked C, E, G, B, like right in a row. Blam. That's literally boom right there. C, E, G, B. Built much in the same way as you would build it on a piano. A lot of people will do this on piano because it's a lot easier to see how you move these chord tones around and add chords when you're looking at them plotted out as opposed to across, you know, on sort of in two different dimensions on guitar. So okay, so there's your major 7 chord. How about a minor 7 chord? Minor 7. Another way you might see this notated is they'll do like a little minus or a dash 7 chord. We'll build a normal minor like we were talking about, remember? Okay, minor is root, flat 3, and 5. We are going to add to this a flat 7 as well. So if we're spelling this out, it is going to be C, E flat, G, and B flat. That is our minor 7 chord. It's a really nice sort of funky sounding chord. It's the way I think of this chord is when I want to use a minor chord but I don't want it to sound quite as somber and dark, I will use a minor 7 chord. Or, you know, that's just one way you can think about it. There's a million different voicings for this. I'm just going to play those for the time being. I could play voicings on minor 7 until 4 in the morning. So there's minor 7. Now, okay, so one of the most common 4-part chords that you will see is known as the dominant 7 chord. Dominant 7. Also known, let me push this over a little bit so I can get some semblance of symmetry going here. Dominant 7. You'll see this notated a lot of times as just 7. If, instead of people saying C dominant 7, they'll just say C7. So, all right. So to build a dominant 7 chord, we have root, 3, 5, and then flat 7. So in this case, as you may have surmised, we have C, E, G, and then B flat. So there's a lot you can say about dominant 7 chords. So I'm just going to give you 2 things really quickly. So okay, you noticed, here let me play the dominant 7 chord just so you can hear it. This is a weird sort of, this chord to me a lot of times, 2 things come to mind with this chord is, first of all, it's a very bluesy, sort of funky sounding chord. Also, a lot of times it sounds like it wants to resolve. Or like this maybe. Something like that. It's just the way that chord tones like to move. So dominant. We also noticed in one of our previous videos where we were talking about different names for the scale tones, that when we talked about the 5th, that was what we called dominant. And now here's the reason for that. the dominant, when you take, we're just going to think of this in C still. If you took this G right here and built a chord, like we've been doing, how we've been kind of doing root 3, 5, da, 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 and going up like that, skipping and making our chords like that. If in this key you took a G, your G, your fifth, we're just gonna make this, we'll call this G dominant, all right. And the key of C is your 5, 7, 9, and 11. It gives you G, B, D, and F. That is naturally going to just spell out a dominant chord. It just falls onto dominant. So that's where this type of 4-part chord gets its name from. So, all right. So there is that. Now, okay, what we're going to do really quickly too here, you might want to just screenshot all this as it happens, because there's so much you can look at here, and I'm just like plowing through it because I'm trying to get as much information to you as I possibly can. Okay, so now another very, very common type of 4-part chord. We were talking about, remember we were talking in the 3-part chords about suspensions. There is sort of another way that you can involve your 9 and your 11 there. Remember, when they were suspended, we referred to them as 2 and 4. What we're going to do now is we're going to add them. Instead of taking the 3 and moving it to 2, we're going to add this tension, this 9 tension to it. So what this becomes referred to as is a C add 9 chord. So what you end up with is your root 3, actually, you know what, how do I want to do this? Yeah, I'm going to write like this. Root 3, 5, and then 9. I could have maybe also written that out as root 9, 3, 5, but because we're using the term 9 here, when you talk about adding tensions as opposed to suspending, you refer to them as the 9 and 11. So I'm going to put it here. C add 9 is a very, 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 very popular sounding chord, a very common sounding chord. So it's a C chord, and you're adding the 9 to it. It's a C major chord, you're adding the 9. You can also do that. You can do that like at the add 11. You can do it with minor chords. You can do all sorts of stuff with that. We're trying to keep this as basic as possible right now. So there's your so add chords. Now, all right. So another thing that you will see here and there are people are going to add tensions to 4-part chords. This is where things can get really, really wacky. I was saying this just goes so much deeper even than what we are going to discuss here. So let's build ourselves a C major 9 chord. So all right, now what a C major 9 chord is it's a C major 7 chord, and we're going to add the 9 tension to it. So what we end up with is the root 3, 5, 7, and 9. Now this is one of those little quirky cases in music, like we were discussing with the dominant chord, where that is referred to as C7. When you add a tension in certain cases to a 4-part chord, it will take the name of the tension will take the place of the 7. So C major 9. This is a great sounding chord. Another nice sort of airy, moody sounding major 7 chord. So there is that. Let's also build ourselves a C minor 9 chord. C minor 9 is going to be root, And remember, okay, like with anything, well, when you're starting off with this, let's start with this by building a minor chord. Root, flat 3, and 5. So we're going to now make this a C minor 7 chord. We add the flat 7. So now we make this a C minor 9. We add the 9. There it is, our C minor 9 chord. It's another great sounding chord. I really, really love this chord. This chord, when you play sort of like cliched sounding Latin stuff or rock guys trying to play jazz, rock guys trying to play jazz will always play like a minor 9 chord. That's what comes to mind. There are other there are obviously many other things that we can do with this. But one thing I do want to mention are you can play around with things in a multitude of ways, but there are a couple little spots where you can get yourself into a little bit of trouble here and there. And these are commonly referred to as avoid tones. And I had a professor in school who referred to them as, instead of avoid tones, as use with caution tones, because it's not necessarily, there's no hard and fast rule that you need to avoid these at all costs. It's just one of these things where things could get a little funky sounding if you're not really careful with them. So for major chords, major 7 chords specifically, the avoid tone is going to be the 11. The tension 11 gets a little bit funky on top of a major 7 chord. And the reason for that being is that you have a half step in here and sort of a little bit of a sensitive area. It's one of these things you kind of have to hear it a few times in context to understand why it is, but for now I'm just going to give you what it is. So major 7 chords, the 11 or the 4 is typically referred to as the avoid tone. For minor chords, minor 7 chords, the avoid tone is typically going to be the 13. So just this is one thing to keep one thing to keep in mind while you're building chords. That these are notes that you want. These are special case notes that you want to kind of keep in mind, that they could start to sound a little bit wacky if you're not careful. Quickly, just because there are a lot of really great examples of this in music, we're going to do an example of adding. Remember we were talking about dominant chords? We are going to add a tension to a dominant chord to make it a dominant with a 9 in it. So this is a great sound. So our normal C dominant chord, if we remember, is root 3, 5, and flat 7, giving us C, E, G, and B flat. We'll make that a dominant 9 by adding a D to it, and presto, we have some it's just a great, another like incredible sounding chord that I really dig. Now, the a really great example of a 5-part dominant chord is a chord called the Hendrix chord. Well, here, really quickly, let me just play this for you really quick. This is what a C9 sounds like, is what they refer to this as. Because remember how we were talking about C dominance is just C7? And remember how we were talking about when you add a tension to a chord, it takes the place of the 7? The same thing applies to dominant chords. So this chord is a C9. So here's our 9 there, on top of, that's a D, on top of our normal dominant chord. So if we take that 9 and sharp it, we get this chord. This is the Hendrix chord. This is from a music theory standpoint, the correct name for this chord would be C7 with a sharp 9. That's what that looks like. Here's an example. I was talking about parentheses. This is an example of where you would use parentheses. So the Hendrix chord, it's kind of a little bit of a misnomer because there are a lot of guys who use this chord. Pink Floyd uses this chord, Stevie Ray uses this chord, I use this chord. But an example of this, like I'll play Purple Haze really quick for you. That's an E, but okay, if we're in C, there's our normal C dominant chord. Adding the sharp 9, and if we remember, sharp 9 just sharping takes this D sharp. We had a D sharp in there. So anyway, that is really. I'm trying to think of what else Here's that last chord right there. That is a wacky looking chord. You got a flat and a sharp in it. So I'm thinking of what else chord-wise that we really need to concern ourselves with in Theory 101. Really, that I did kind of go a little bit into Theory 102, just because chord theory is something I hold dear and I really love. And I think that every musician should know it, and the fact that every musician doesn't know it is a tragedy to me, because it is just an absolutely beautiful thing, and you can build some amazing stuff with it. So this is if you don't get anything else out of any other part of this video, this is the thing that I think, this is really the magnum opus of this theory video, is how we build chords.